Welcome everyone to this webinar, which is organized by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development and the World Bank's Finance and Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. The topic for today is how COVID-19 has increased vulnerability in the informal economy and business environment solutions. So let me first thank you all for joining. My name is Andrea Marušić. I'm from the World Bank's group FCI Global Practice, and I will be chairing this event. So before we actually start with the topic, I wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping information. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording along with the presentation slides will be sent to all the participants afterwards and the ones who registered for the event. It's February 10th, 2021. So if people will be watching this in the future, just to put a timestamp on it. Everyone is muted and your video is hidden. So you will just see for now the video of the panelists. You have a Q&A function in Zoom, which we would like you to use. Your questions are valuable, and you can use the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. So after the introduction to the topic, we have an excellent panel of experts and agency representatives who will tell us about the work they're doing to support reforms in the informal economy. We also have two discussants who have a deep understanding of informality in developing economies. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Let me just start by giving you a sort of an oversimplified introduction to this complex and very important topic. What do we know when it comes to informality and COVID-19? Well, we know for sure that the informal sector is prevalent in many developing countries. It's a major source of job opportunities and economic activities. We'll hear some numbers later on, which are really striking, which are also new to me. The ILO has come out with some new numbers on this. We know that COVID-19 has had a staggering impact. And we know that the hardest hit have been low-income informal workers and businesses. And this is different in this COVID-19 crisis than in previous recessions and crises, where the informal economy was really steadily persisting. And how is it different? It's very different because it really very quickly exposed the vulnerability of the informal sector, and because the economic impact was actually felt before the health impact. So in many developing countries, the stay-at-home orders and other containment measures were put in place very quickly, and that meant that in that sense, the informal economy was actually, we could say, one of the first victims of COVID-19. This is because these containment measures resulted really in a direct overnight loss in livelihood, and you know, in some respect, this could be short-term, but also long-term impacts. If you imagine a street vendor, maybe the infrastructure will not be there anymore, and we see that in some of our developing countries. Just the infrastructure is disappearing, just as an example. There is a gender dimension as well, and we will be hearing a bit about that as well. In many developing countries, the percentage of women exceeds the percentage of men in the informal sector, and then with the closing of schools, that becomes exacerbated. Now, what else do we know that may be important in times of recovery and the policies that are put in place? We know that many of the pre-COVID interventions that were meant to incentivize and foster formalization really have had modest results, to be generous. Interventions such as reducing costs, facilitating entry, tax incentives. We have tried all that, and these can be very costly for the government. And very often these costs overweight the benefits. So there is not really major impact in terms of formalization, and the subsistence type of informal businesses do not react to these short-term incentives. So that's just an example. And I believe, and we believe, there is an opportunity to reshape how we view informality, to rethink the policy-making approaches to promote formalization. And this webinar is part of this puzzle. So much more about what we know and what we don't know, we will hear right now from our panelists. So If we could just put up the slide with our panelists. In our panel today, we have Judith van Doorn from the ILO. We have Laura Atienza from the European Commission, and we have our colleague Mohammad Amin from the World Bank. So let me start with the impact of COVID, and how much do we know on the impact of COVID on informal businesses. And Judith, over to you, and then Laura to give us a bit of an introduction to this.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. First of all, I think it's important to say that we don't have the full picture yet of what is the impact of the pandemic on informal enterprises and workers. But we have been doing some assessments at the country level to assess the impact. So these were rapid assessments, and we have been talking to governments, social partners, business associations, and so on. But we've also had WhatsApp discussion groups with people in the informal economy to ask them what they're going through. And we did this because we knew they were going through a lot and we didn't know what they were going through, and we had to give them a voice. So I will share with you a few main takeaways from these studies. And I will focus on what has been especially the impact for informal enterprises. They've had challenges that formal enterprises had as well, but I'll zoom in on the ones that are specific to informal enterprises. So on this slide, you can see in Burkina Faso, an informal market that was closed down. So the government felt that these informal markets, they're very densely populated, they're a high risk for being contaminated with the disease. So the markets were closed down, and people then immediately lost their source of income. And as we know, they don't have the financial buffers. Every day that they're not working is a struggle for them. So they then, as you can see on the right side of this slide, they contested these measures. And they wanted to find a solution. So then the government ultimately decided to relocate some people, open some markets, but people were shifted to the outskirts of the city where the infrastructure wasn't available for them, to do their business, let's say. So what we came and what we got a lot as information from the studies is that people and informal enterprises, they said, they were not being consulted. They have business associations, they could have been looking for solutions, but it just didn't happen. And that was really a big problem for them. So maybe you can remove this slide, Simon, and then a second point, but maybe not this one yet. A second point that we learned is that people needed financial support and they needed it quickly. And we know that governments across the world, they have been putting in place financial support, but this has been mainly for formal enterprises. And that makes sense because formal enterprises, they are known to the government, they've been paying taxes, so it makes sense to support them. But at the same time, we know that there are many economies where the informal economy is very big and it employs very many people. So it makes sense to do something for them as well. And indeed, some governments have put in place, let's say, a fund, financial support for people in the informal sector, but this has not always been at the speed at which it was needed. So for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, we are working with the government on this fund and seeing how people can get access and how people can formalize to have sustained access. But in Burkina Faso, where we did a study, people mentioned to us that a fund was announced, but 2 months later, they didn't have any money yet. They didn't receive the support. And as we know, this has been very difficult for them, again, because they don't have the buffers. So they became indebted, they didn't have access to credit. Sometimes they renegotiated an existing loan with a microfinance institution. Sometimes they tried with support of their business associations to get a new loan, but basically they struggled. And then the third and last point that I want to make is that from a study in Nepal, we learned that the informalization has been a big concern for informal enterprises. So they are worried that formal enterprises shift into informality and that people who have a job in the formal economy lose it, and then they go into the informal economy to find a way to make a living. So this makes the informal economy more competitive and people will struggle more. So what I've learned from all of this is that it's very important to give urgent support to people to keep their businesses alive and to consult people to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. Just to complement on what Judith was saying, this crisis is having an unprecedented impact with enormous consequences in terms of social and economic development. In a recent report from the ILO, you mentioned, or it's mentioned, that there's the lost income of informal workers in upper middle countries has increased of about 20%. And in low income countries, it has increased of around 50 points. So we are talking about a huge impact in the lost income of informal workers. The impact also is related, of course, as everyone probably has read, in terms of food security, in terms of high exposure to health risks, but also in terms not only of lost income, but also in terms of perspectives of how to get income, a perspective of a job. And there I would like to underline the vulnerability of especially young people. From a study that we have in Southern Africa, more than 90% of young and old people, so we are talking about 15 to 24 years and above 65, are informal workers. And that's why we also think that the question of training in going over through the recovery and ahead is very important to be taken into consideration also with governments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Laura. Now, maybe a question that comes is about the fact that we often hear complaints and that comes out in our own enterprise surveys about formal businesses in developing countries complaining about unfair competition from their peers in the informal sector. So Mohammad, this is a question for you. Can you tell us a bit about the findings in this context, and where are they expected to be impacted in the pandemic? How much do we know about that interaction between the formal and the informal sector?
Yes, thank you, Andre. Now, the impact of the informal sector on the formal sector has been a matter of debate, and the opinion is very sharply divided on that. And there are different models or different viewpoints on this issue. And I think from the context, from the point of view of this paper, this question, and the ongoing pandemic, I think there are two basic models that I would want to point out here. The first is what is called the dual economy view, or the model, which basically says that the informal firms are just too small, they're very unproductive, they operate in areas which are very different from formal firms, and so there is absolutely no overlap between them, neither from the formal to the informal or from the informal to the formal. So they are completely separate spheres kind of models. The other view is called the parasite view, and it's not a very nice word to use, but I guess that's what is used in the literature. So this view says that informal firms are definitely capable of competing against formal firms. And the reason why they are informal is because they choose to be informal to avoid costly regulations and taxes and other such costs which formal firms have to bear. And because of this difference, it creates a uneven playing field between formal and informal. Now, the competition is generally good for the industry, if not for the firm at least. But when the competition becomes unfair, that is, the informal firms do not have to pay taxes or they don't have to pay social security, and formal firms have to do that, then it begins to hurt the formal sector. Now, in the enterprise surveys, we typically find that about 30 to 40% of the formal sector firms, they say that competition from informal firms is a major obstacle for their business operations. So this tends to support the parasite view and not the dual economy view. So that's at least from the point of view of the enterprise surveys in my department that I work in, we are closer to the opinion that yes, the informal firms can hurt the formal firms, and there are studies that show that. For example, a recent paper in World Development Journal in 2016 by Distinguin and other authors, they show that the unfair competition from informal to the formal tends to hurt the profitability of the formal firms and thereby hurting their access to finance. So access to finance really goes down for firms that are competing against informal firms. Now, how COVID-19 has changed the impact of informal on the formal. I think it's certainly there's no study right now which can definitely answer that question, but we have some broad guidelines from the past studies which we can use to see where this might go to. And I think the impact depends on a few broad points. And the first one is the size of the informal sector. So as the size of the informal sector grows, the impact of the informal on the formal, which usually is found to be negative in most cases, is going to grow also at the same time. And all indications are that the informal sector is expanding because a lot of people who are losing their formal sector jobs are slipping into informality. That's one. The other element of how the informal might affect the formal in the context of the pandemic is that it depends upon the profitability of operating in the formal versus the informal sector. So as the business environment, let's say, improves, or there's more government support for the formal firms, the formal sector becomes much better at competing with the informal sector than is the case otherwise. So it will depend how the policy shapes up then. So size of the informal sector, how it grows in the future, and what government policies are in place down the road in the future, which will determine the relative profitability of formal and informal. So I think those are the two big ideas that we will look forward to in seeing how this pandemic will shape out in terms of the impact of the informal on the formal.
Thanks, Mohammad. This is fascinating, and we may have time to get to the question of heterogeneity across businesses in the formal sector, which is also, I think, important to understand this aspect of competing between the formal and the informal sector as well. So maybe moving on to solutions as well. What are some of the promising practices to reduce vulnerabilities in the informal sector in view of and during the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'll start with you, Laura, and then after that, Judith. And we have a special guest as well, Simba Sibanda from the ILO Harare office, who will contribute to this topic as well.
Thank you, Andrea. So first, let me just make a very short introduction of what has been done by the EU in an immediate way. No? So first, it was a question of supporting health systems and providing liquidity to governments. So since back in March, there have been actions in this sense, and more than 15 billion euro have been provided of existing programs are derived to support, well, against the health crisis and resulting human needs in a first stance. And there, in particular, it had the humanitarian air bridge has been developed, and as of today, more than 1,100 tons of human and medical aid have been provided in 20 countries, and also around 1,700 passengers transported, and 4 operations have been done in common with the World Food Programme. Another element that has also notorious support is to the COVAX facility for equitable access to affordable COVID-19 vaccines, where there has been a support of 100 million. And also there has been a contribution to the IMF Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. This should allow to provide temporary debt service relief on IMF loans for 29 countries most affected of low-income countries. So just taking that link on revenue compensation that I just mentioned, thinking about the fact that countries need to provide more public investment to navigate the crisis and for later as well. There's the question of the debt. There's the question of the debt, and there's maybe several of you know, participants, the common framework of the G20, which is ongoing, and where there are initiatives of debt suspension, to several countries. The EU as such is not a creditor in this, but is part of the discussions. But for instance, one thing that has been done in Somalia is to cancel arrears of the debt to be able to access high peak program of the IMF. Public finance management. The management of public management and debt to increase public investment. There's also more work that is being done in increasingly link social protection and food security with public finance management. And that's something that, we are developing further. On revenue compensation, but on another note, let me mention what Togo, the country of Togo, is doing. They have established in April, if I'm not wrong, this universal revenue. Well, it's not universal because it's temporary and it's targeted to informal workers. So they have set up a revenue for informal workers that is accessed that is paid in a digital manner. 570,000 people have already benefited from this. And the government is thinking of using the platform which provides the digital payment, which is Novisi, of regrouping the different social protection programs for informal workers that may come through this end. So this has two interesting aspects. One, direct compensation to informal workers during the crisis, and two, the use of digital solutions. I would also like to mention the example of collaborative economy models. So there are several things, there are so many fronts that have to be tackled right now for the future. That solutions or models, let's say, which may not be perfect, but which can combine an increase of income, access to healthcare, social protection, and as well access to training, access to markets, and access to have a voice in public policy in an easier way than being a micro entrepreneur or auto entrepreneur, depending on how do we define it, can be these collaborative economy models, and in particular, for instance, cooperatives. We will hear later Dr. Rose Karimi. She will provide us from the International Cooperatives Alliance. She will provide an example in Zimbabwe, which is working well and involving youth as well. There's also an example to mention in terms of cooperatives, which is Sewa in India. It's a women cooperative. As we know, women are very hard hit, and therefore also children. So they are providing food in the canteens they have. It's a big cooperative, a successful one. They are providing food to children in the canteen, and they are also providing low-cost sanitizers and access to and low-cost access to health care. So this community approach can enable to tackle different angles of the crisis. Then I cannot agree more on what Judith mentioned earlier about the dialogue. This is also something that we are in particular pushing through our EU delegations mainly, to have inclusive dialogue, and in particular to listen to informal workers, because solutions cannot need to be tailored. And for instance, also making a comment on Judith's presentation, in Colombia, to street vendors, there has been there's a program that we have, Socio Plus, which is about social protection. And in the framework of this program, there has been a support to street vendors to set up a place which is not completely closed, so it can be accessed, but it's cleaned, and there's the way of continuing activities instead of closing them. So dialogue is, I completely agree, that is very important and can provide alternative solutions and tailored solutions to current problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Judith, and then Simba.
Thanks. Yeah, I will hand over to Simba because he can present some work that we've been doing in Zimbabwe. And we chose this example because it has entry points for business environment reform. Over to you, Simba.
I think, Simon, we would need the slides up.
Thank you, Andrea and Judith. I want to share some experience from a program we're implementing in Zimbabwe. We are focused on Bulawayo, which is the country's second largest city. And I want to start by sharing a SNAP survey we conducted to find out the impact of COVID-19 on micro enterprises in the city. This was late 2020. We found that micro enterprises were reporting a 70% decline in revenues and up to about 25% job losses. When we asked them about their confidence moving ahead, quite a lot of them were expressing a sentiment that they are likely to close down because they are spending their capital during the shutdowns and the lockdowns. But despite this gloomy picture, we have had some very interesting experiences where we have managed to support certain micro enterprises to take advantage of shortages of essential goods and services related to the COVID-19 pandemic. We supported these enterprises through 3 ways. The first one was to roll out occupational safety and health advisory services and to train them to ensure that they could comply with health conditions which would allow them to reopen. We also went a little bit further and ensured that the occupational safety and health training went beyond the immediate COVID-19 risks, but also touched on traditional risks and allowing these businesses to operate in a more productive way in the long term. The second one was that we, through business management training, supported the micro enterprises to undertake scanning and assessments of their businesses to develop business continuity plans, but also to scan the market and identify opportunities that they could quickly move into and fill by repurposing their facilities and producing goods that were in demand at that particular point. You can see on this slide, there are 2 images. The first one is of a factory. This business pre-COVID-19 was engaged in borehole drilling and the offering of engineering services. Immediately when COVID came in, they repurposed their production and they moved into production of hospital beds. So it was one of the small enterprises that actually contributed to the establishment of one of the 3 isolation centers in this particular city. And then the third area which helped the micro enterprises is the work around strengthening of linkages and supporting informal economy enterprises to network, particularly with government institutions such as the Department for SMEs, institutions of learning like the local university. They've gotten into an MOU where the local university's research function supports those in the informal economy, as well as private sector. These linkages became in very handy when COVID struck. And I'm sure when we get to the next slide, I'll be able to illustrate this. Simon, next slide, please. Now, the 2 images, again, is another illustration of a business which moved into the production of hand sanitizers and other related detergents. But beyond support to the micro enterprises, what was also important for business continuity is the role that certain institutions played. The first institution was the Business Association, which was supported to make sure that it becomes stronger, it becomes more effective in terms of lobbying. This enhanced capacity allowed it to lobby government at local level quite effectively and quite early on. What then happened is that members of this association were able to secure exemption letters which allowed them to reopen their businesses way much sooner than the other formal businesses. And this had the effect of making them more agile, but also giving them the advantage of providing goods and services which no one else on the market had. The second issue, which is related to linkages, is that there were a lot of very interesting partnerships initially with the local university, the relationship was on designing workspaces, but when COVID came, they took advantage of that, and the local university actually partnered with micro enterprises in the informal economy through their business association to provide quality assurance on goods such as masks and sanitizers, which gave the market confidence to procure from these micro enterprises. And then the third one, which relates to local procurement, is that the classification of these businesses as essential services, the easing of procurement rules and making them much more flexible made it more attractive for these micro enterprises to move ahead and comply with certain requirements for registration. And it made it possible for them to sell goods and services to formal institutions, private and public. Quite a lot of the business actually came from government departments, universities, and schools. So businesses that would historically not be able to access these opportunities did so. In conclusion, I think a couple of things to reflect on looking ahead. I think long term, we're actually looking to support businesses to develop workspaces which are more resilient to the current and future pandemics, working with the local university on the research and design side. We are also noting that businesses in the informal economy continue to be agile. When the other business did open up, some of these micro enterprises started to lose the business because they could not compete with the bigger and established businesses. But what we have learned is that there's a certain agility with micro enterprises in the informal economy. They continue to innovate and move to different areas. The third lesson long term is that perceptions, for example, local authority are shifting. I think the model for collecting revenue at local authority level was you take someone where they are. But if they're working from home, how do you collect revenue? So we now see an increasingly growing level of acceptance in terms of the local authority providing more services to these businesses. Lastly, I think it's the question of how do we scale this and how do we replicate? I think it's one city, a few micro enterprises, but we are trying to partner with government in terms of the upcoming national informalization strategy and upcoming national policies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Since we don't have a World Bank panelist and I'm chairing, I will take this opportunity also to say that the World Bank has stepped up on this challenge in the past year, and that our programs that were normally in the range of 42 billion per year grew last year to about 70 billion, and specific COVID-related operations were developed to the tune of 25 billion. So there has been a lot of speeding up support also through the IDA fund, which is for the poorest countries, and as well as through the debt service suspension initiative. So maybe moving on to Mohammad, a question for you. And it's about, we all see the impact of COVID on informal businesses in particular has been staggering, but can we see anything positive? Are there also some positive examples for the informal sector that we can see or can be expected in this situation?
Yes, thanks, Andre, for the question. About the positives, I think we can look forward to, I would say, two positives. These are broad ones, so there'll be many sub-positives within them. The first one I would say is what I would call an industry shakeup. So typically what we see is that the entry into the informal sector, either by individuals as workers or by firms or entrepreneurs, it's not only based on to seek employment or profitable opportunities, it's also out of stress. So something happens, some calamity strikes like the pandemic, or somebody loses a job, or something else happens, some change in government policy, which leads to a shrinkage of the formal sector, and then people are pushed into informality. And that is informality, they take it as a last resort. Well, let's wait for better opportunities to come up. In the meantime, we can work in the informal sector. Now, once people enter the informal sector, there's a certain sunk cost involved in entering the sector. And once they incur that cost, there's a certain comfort level that sets in. Well, things are going fine, we can just survive. We've already made the sunk cost, so let's continue with that. So one of the things that the pandemic is probably going to do is destroy a lot of the sunk cost. So now I think people are free to make those fresh choices. So they'll be out of their comfort zones, and they will probably, and hopefully, they will be making fresh choices about what activities to pursue, what sub-industry to go in, and whether they want to stay in the formal, or they want to stay in the informal, or they want to try something in the formal sector. So that's a broad idea about shakeups that happen, and they typically leave industry better off. And there's a recent study actually which came out, NBR paper by Nicholas Bloom and some of his other colleagues, for the formal sector. It's not for the informal, but it is for the formal, but we can glean something from that. And this study shows that the pandemic, the COVID-19, has led to a sharp reduction in manufacturing total factor productivity in some of the advanced countries that they look at. But the silver lining there is that there is a sharp industry shakeup. That is, industries that were less productive are shrinking, and industries that are more productive are expanding. And within an industry, output or market share is moving from less productive to more productive firms. And I think that that shift that is happening now, it will probably continue even after the pandemic is over, for the simple reason that firms that are gaining right now, or industries that are gaining right now, they'll probably keep this advantage even in the long run. So I'm hoping that in the informal sector, something like that we might see, maybe not to the same scale as in the formal sector, but at least to some extent. And if that happens, I think that would take care, at least to some extent, one of the biggest problems with the informal sector, which is very low productivity. The other positive that I would think of is more online activities. Digitization may now be a forced strategy that the informal sector cannot avoid anymore. And that will be a blessing in disguise, because in the long run, it will definitely increase their productivity and incomes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, now just to sort of continue this stream of what is promising, and is there a positive impact, but also what are some of the promising practices that would foster formalization. And I did mention in the introduction to the topic the sort of mixed results we have had up to now, and the fact that subsistence type of businesses do not react to sort of short-term benefits or incentives. So we would like to hear from you, Judith and Laura, what you see as some of these promising practices that may be emerging, or that we may need to rethink as well.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. So I think for me, the main issue is incentives, and I prepared a slide on that because we know business registration has been done, a lot has been done to make it easier. One-stop shops have been created, online registration is possible, and of course it had some results, but it has not done the trick. So we need to make it more attractive for enterprises to formalize. We know not everybody can formalize right now, but some of them could if we give them the right incentives. So the question then is, what are the right incentives? And this is why I've put together this slide. So this comes from Brazil. In Brazil, there's a legal statute for individual micro-entrepreneurs. So you can register when you're individual micro-entrepreneur and you get access to Social Security. And there are other benefits, you pay a nominal tax, etc. But you become a formal economic unit. And this slide shows on the left top that 1 in 3 micro-entrepreneurs in Brazil have identified access to Social Security as a main motivation for them to formalize. And I think this really creates some opportunities. We know that the system in Brazil has had its challenges. It's been heavily subsidized. So I think governments need to find the balance between how much subsidy are you putting in, but the logic is there. And if I think back, when I was a consultant, I would have opted for this system, getting access to Social Security, because that's a concern when you work on your own as a self-employed person. In Morocco, for example, there's a similar approach right now. It's quite new, so we don't have the data yet about the effect, but you can also register as self-employed micro-entrepreneur. You get access to Social Security, and I'm really curious to learn more about how that then works to lift formalization. The second takeaway from this slide is at the bottom. If you look at the bottom left and the bottom right, you see that enterprises have mentioned enterprise formalization and the permission to issue an invoice as another motivation to formalize. Together again, this is 1 in 3 entrepreneurs. So it shows me that for them, the opportunity to operate in the formal economy is an incentive to formalize. And again, it will not work for everybody, but for some, it will work. And I want to mention to you quickly as a teaser, we're going to have a webinar with the Beam Exchange, which will talk about this. It's on the 4th of March, and it talks about a market systems development program in Georgia that has helped people in the dairy sector to formalize and gain access to the formal economy. And it actually has made these businesses resilient in the context of COVID. So what is my takeaway from this? For me, the main questions are, what are the incentives to formalize and for whom and under what conditions? And I will be very happy to work with any of you on this. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I follow in Judith's words. It's about incentives, and it's also probably about how these incentives then are compensated in terms of what it costs to those who would formalize. No, I just read precisely on Brazil. I think it's the FEPAL made has some numbers on the fact that micro enterprises, which means one person of less than 5, and most of them have one person employed, more than 80% of those enterprises of one person don't pay the social security contributions. So, and if they are of more than 5, then more than 70% do pay the social security contributions. So I think there's another angle also to look at, which is whether the models of costing for people accessing the formalization, even with the right incentives, are fine or not really, no? Then we were talking before about access to about revenue compensations. So maybe also we have here an opportunity if there are systems established for informal workers to access to revenue compensation, like we were discussing about of the example in Togo, to use digital solutions also to register them. And there can be also an incentive to formalize in order to have access to revenue compensation and to access to social protection at this point. Now, now that there's the crisis, now that we have to navigate it. So, for instance, in Togo, they were thinking of precisely using also these digital tools in order for people to have access to compensated to revenue compensation, to think about further registration first, registration of people, and also then further formalization. So maybe there's also an avenue there to work more on formalization in this moment. Then I would like to come back again to the cooperatives or to collaborative economy models. There's also an opportunity there for formalizing workers. Rose Karimi, then in her presentation, I think she will mention some of the numbers in a small cooperative, how an important percentage of young people have been formalized thanks to the cooperative model. Then just making reference to the link between, or the dichotomy of this possible competition between formal and informal enterprises, more than workers. The issue of corruption, of course, is something that needs to continue to be looked at. So when there are this type of policy measures, that's also something, another angle that of course can be regarded. And finally, again, dialogue, no? Precisely to be able to target which are the right incentives, as Judith very nicely presented, or which are the right costs that can be supported by informal workers. The dialogue tables are very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think this actually is a nice conclusion to our panel. We are out of time for our panel, but it gives some important proposals in terms of looking forward as well. And if I can put it in a nutshell, I think we're aligned on that there is scope to rethink approaches to informal businesses, that we should be, of course, thinking about what the various typologies of informal businesses are, and sort of target the interventions depending on that as well. That it's all incentives that are very important. Not everyone will ever or should formalize, and it's time to think about also how to balance between what the state subsidizes and the benefits that can be achieved. There are many examples and pilots that we have done over the years. The perspective of clusters and cooperatives is also important. I want to take this opportunity also to publicize a bit the recent publication that we've done on this topic. It's about rethinking approaches to informal businesses, and we will, I hope, share that with the participants as well, where we identify these, let's say, promising new areas we could be thinking of, including clusters and cooperatives, including behavioral insights to understand incentives, including introducing some intermediate legal forms and sort of grace periods in which informal businesses could be provided such incentives to formalize those ones that have the potential to do so. So let's conclude our panel here and move to our next session, which is with our external discussants. So maybe Simon, you could pull up the slides and just the slide with our external discussants. We have Dr. Marty Chen. She's a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and senior advisor in women in informal employment. And we have Dr. Rose Karimi. She's a program manager in Africa in the International Cooperatives Alliance. So welcome, Marty and Rose. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. And Marty, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have 3 pairs of slides. The first pair is about the significance and the composition of informal enterprises. The second pair is on the impact of COVID. And the third pair is about sort of the relief to recovery to what I would call reform trajectory regarding the informal economy. So first, a data slide here. This is from the ILO publication, Women and Men in the Informal Economy, a Statistical Picture. It's the 3rd edition of that in 2008. And it brought in the first ever global estimates. So and these are just 2 tables from that. One is informal employment and self-employment as a percentage of total employment. And you'll see that globally, well over half of all workers are informal. And if you ship developing countries, it's 90%. But self-employment is also much higher than we would have anticipated. It's 44% of all workers globally. And again, it goes much higher when you move to the developing economies. In that report, there's also an estimation of informal enterprises themselves as a percentage of total employment and of total enterprises. And the estimation is based on the sum from labor force statistics of employers and own account workers. The own account are the single person or head of family units. And what it shows is that these informal enterprises, what is called the informal sector, it's the enterprise-based definition, informal sector, comprise 52% of the global employment. So the other 9% of informal employment outside of the enterprises is wage employment for formal firms that is informal, or wage employment for households that is in employment. And I think it's 7% is wage employment in formal enterprises, and 2% of that difference between 61 and 52 is wage employment in households. But this also shows that 81% of enterprises globally are informal. Unfortunately, they didn't separate the emerging and the developing. So we have a percentage for both. And you'll see that 83% of enterprises in developing and emerging economies are informal. And I just want to say that this is based on what could be called a proxy measure, but we also have recent evidence from Senegal, the 2016 General Census of Enterprises, that shows 97% of non-ag enterprises are informal, and they account for 60% of non-ag employment. So it confers with these more proxy measures. Next. I also thought it was important to look at the composition. I think various of the speakers, the panelists, have pointed to the need to disaggregate this large phenomenon of informal employment and informal enterprises. And we don't have this distribution, percent distribution for the enterprises per se, but we do for informal employment. But we be reminded most informal employment is self-employment. So this is a good, so we know that of the self-employed informally, only 3% are employers. 45% are these own account workers, single person or heads of family farms or family units. And 16% are contributing family workers who work with the designated head of the family unit in the family farm or in the family firm. And if we look at the distribution by branch of industry, there's some real significant differences by country income groups, right? So in developing countries, a lot of this is in agriculture still, and then services followed by industry. In emerging countries, the shift is more towards the services, and then once you get to the developed, it's significantly in services. I also shared findings on informal employment by occupational groups, because that gives you a sort of more concrete sense of who we're talking about. And this is for urban India, the 2011-12 labor force survey. So we see that a huge percentage, a large percentage, are in informal trade of various kinds, and a significant percent are home-based workers. In fact, we know in India that 1/3 of all manufacturing units in India are home-based, and 1/3 of all women workers are home-based. And there's manufacturing, of course, outside the home as well, but at 13%. Construction workers, a big sector, 12. Transport workers, 9, but not far behind them are domestic workers. Waste pickers, about 1%. And then the services is the big lumpy category, and there are other services. So I think the point is that most self-employed, most informal enterprises are run by person or family units. And I think we should mention that the data don't capture how many of those single person operators are also in co-ops or also in producer groups, because that is certainly one strategy for them to get better access to inputs and to markets. And the other, going back to Senegal, the data from that 2016 census shows that 53% of non-ag informal enterprises are in trade. But what happened at the beginning of COVID? The largest natural market of informal traders in Dakar was destroyed, and somebody has referenced, I think it was Simba, the destruction of the infrastructure. And that is a huge concern to these workers going forward. Next. Just to say that the WIEGO network that I am with and helped found has done a 12-city study, and we've got cities in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, and Eastern Europe. And we looked at 4 occupational groups in those cities. And I just want to share next a summary slide of findings. So the impact on work and earnings, as somebody said, it was overnight, it was dire. And so 67% of the respondents were not working at all in April, which was the period of peak lockdowns in virtually all of the cities. And so 70% of respondents reported zero earnings for the month. And on average, the earnings then were 25% of pre-COVID earnings, which we pegged as February 2020. By June, because we did the survey in June, so we had the retrospective to April and February, 20% of the respondents were still not able to return to work. And the average earnings were only 58% of pre-COVID earnings, despite the relaxation of restrictions and curfews. So the coping strategies have left them very depleted in terms of resources and much further in debt, because nearly 40% had to borrow money, 43% drew down their savings, and 10% sold assets. So they're starting the recovery from a very depleted point. And the other is, it's really important, this is the disaggregation, looking at different pathways of impact, which lead in fact to pathways of recovery. So for the pathway for the home-based workers who produce goods and services from their home is that they had this immediate decline in work orders due to disruptions in domestic and global supply chains. One of the study cities was the t-shirt capital of the world, Tirupur, India, and the factories just closed. And when the factories closed, there are no work orders for the home-based workers. And when they start up, and they had only started up factory about 40% by October, November, they don't put out work to the home workers because they're trying to find work for their factory workers. The street vendors faced and all of this is in addition to the common restrictions on movement, is a closure of the wholesale markets, making it hard for them to buy the goods that they would sell, and a closure of their own natural markets. And I would add that in many of the cities, the malls and retail stores were allowed to reopen in the phased easing of lockdowns long before the wholesale markets and the natural markets of street vendors, which are actually safer than retail shops. And they have protocols. We developed protocols for them to trade safely in the natural markets. And the waste pickers, who do a yeoman's duty of collecting and sorting and reclaiming waste before it ends up in the dumps and landfills. The dumps and landfills were closed often, and there was a great drop in demand for reclaimed waste because of the slowdown in manufacturing. But I want to add on the solutions note, one of the things that the partner organizations in each city and WIEGO fought for was for these workers to be deemed essential workers, providing essential services. So in some places we were able to have that street vendors, especially those who sell food, were deemed essential and were allowed to move about. And home-based workers were there. They were repurposed into making masks and hospital gowns. And the waste pickers were deemed essential in the waste management cycle. So that points to the way forward, much like Simba talked about for Tanzania. Next. Each of the cities, 12 cities, had demands from the workers and the local organizations of informal workers. And I just club these into 3 phases: relief, recovery, and reforms. So the relief is that they still need continuing financial assistance to pay off debts and restore savings and assets. And soft loans might be good, but really what they need is much more cash assistance for the relief to recovery, to stabilize what they have, and then they can grow. And then there's the recovery of livelihoods and employment. So recovery cash grants plus stimulus packages, including public procurement for essential services, much like Simba talked about. And then we need, going forward, we need to learn the lessons of how COVID exposed the fault lines in existing systems and exacerbated them as well. So the legal and policy environment, both national and local, needs to be more enabling of these enterprises. And social protection going forward has to include not only social assistance and cash grants, but also social insurance. Next. And this is a slide on what urban enterprises need. And I don't know if this is business environment or city environment, but it's what the city does that has a huge impact on the livelihoods, their productivity, their ability to survive and recover. So in terms of recovery of livelihoods and employment, they need regulated access to and right to work in public spaces, which is one pillar of the ILO recommendation 204 on formalization. The street vendors need to be able to operate in public spaces in good locations. The waste pickers have their roots through the cities. The natural markets of street vendors need to be reopened, and the sorting area and spaces for the waste pickers. All of them need basic infrastructure services at their workplaces and transport services between home markets and workplace. But then there's the legal and policy environment. They need the right to work in public space. And they need decreased harassment, bribes, confiscation, and evictions. And I just want to point out that many of these things are not costly to the exchequer. They're not financial investments. It's a change in the mindset about these enterprises. And there is a third model to the two models that Mohammad raised, which is that informal workers actually contribute to the formal economy. They're providing goods and services at low costs that benefit the formal firms. And they also help to grow the economy overall. So some of these are just a change in mindset and a reversal of the negative narrative. Legal protections against abuse by local authorities and the police, decriminalization of informal activities, zoning laws that allow informal workers to work in their own homes. If 1/3 of all manufacturing units in India are home-based and the zoning laws don't allow for mixed use in residential areas, that's a problem. And most fundamentally, these informal workers, their enterprises, their livelihoods need to be integrated into urban planning and design. When we shift the main wholesale market from agricultural produce across the bay in Mumbai, that's easy for people who are delivering perhaps, but what about the street vendors who are the frontline distributors of that food? How do they go to a wholesale market across the bay? So we really do need to build them into our plans. Next. Final slide. So going forward, post-COVID, there are three possible scenarios. One is we return to the old normal, which was bad for informal enterprises. The second is that we have a worse New Deal, that there are reverse gains made for informal enterprises, like the destruction of street vendor markets, like the shifting of wholesale markets. So many examples, like the changing of the norms for who qualifies as a micro, small, and medium enterprises, so to allow larger enterprises to compete for the recovery grants. Or are we going to have a better New Deal that both protects and promotes these? So the fundamentals for a better New Deal are to recognize and value these informal enterprises and not see them as a parasite. To integrate informal enterprises into urban plans, policies, and regulations, and then address specific constraints and needs of the specific groups by status and employment, branch of industry, and occupational group or sector. And the guiding principles are do no harm, stop all of this harassment, bribes, confiscations, evictions, stop the negative narratives. This is where most of the working poor are employed. And then a point that has been made by both Judith and Laura about the dialogue And I think Simba as well, is nothing for us without us, is the motto of the global movement of informal workers. Include them in the relief, recovery, and reform processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. This was incredibly rich, and for those of that haven't seen some of these numbers, really mind-blowing when it comes to the magnitude. Now, before I turn it over to Rose, can I just also alert our panelists that by using the Q&A function, they can also type the answer as well, since I'm mindful of time and I'm afraid that we will not have as much time as we would want for answering, then maybe we could use this function as well. Okay, so Rose, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me start by talking about International Cooperative Alliance, and then I'll touch on the importance of cooperatives. I will then go to a case about the youth cooperatives that International Cooperative Alliance is working with. And then I'll give some recommendations and then end my presentation. So let's start with the first slide on International Cooperative Alliance. It's a non-governmental organization that unites, promotes, and develops cooperatives. Established in 1895, is member-based and is the voice of cooperatives worldwide, representing an estimated 300 million cooperatives worldwide. That tells you that it's a representation of more than 1 billion cooperative members. Next. Now, the International Cooperative Alliance is in 4 regions. So we have Africa, Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe, and with 1 global office. Next. Now, in terms of members, the Americas has 98 from 24 countries. Europe has 67 members from 33 countries. Asia Pacific, 110 members from 32 countries. And in Africa, we have 40 members from 23 countries. In total, 318 members from 112 countries. That's a very large organization. Next. Well, in terms of the importance of cooperatives, I got these statistics from the World Cooperative Monitor 2020. And in the top 300 cooperatives worldwide, their combined turnover is $2,146 billion US. That tells you that cooperatives are in every sector of the economy. They are important, and we can actually leverage on cooperatives to promote development, not only in developing countries, but in other continents as well. Now, if you look at those statistics again, in the top 300 cooperatives, 104 are from agriculture and food-related industries. That tells you for developing countries like Africa, where most of the countries are dependent on agriculture, then cooperatives becomes a business model that is promising and that can help people sustain their livelihoods. Of course, the next one is insurance. I know some of you, like those in the States, have come across an insurance like State Farm. Maybe you didn't know it's a cooperative. Today, I'm here to tell you that that's a cooperative. So cooperatives are actually essential. They're in every aspect of our economy. And as we move on, let's move on, Simon, thank you. The International Cooperative Alliance recognizes that the youth crisis in terms of massive unemployment, it could be a crisis, but in that we see an opportunity. We see an opportunity to engage the youth in cooperatives and include them in cooperatives. I've just shown you a slide of how cooperatives are important in economic development and also in sustainable livelihoods for people around the world. In this case, the International Cooperative Alliance decided to engage the youth as a way of including them in the global cooperative movement. The next slide. How do we engage them? We have a program called the Global Cooperative Entrepreneurs, which is a mentoring program. It's framed within the ICA-EU partnerships, which we call the COPs for Dev, and it was inspired by Cooperatives Europe. That's one of the regions of the International Cooperative Alliance, COP Starter 2.0, which is an Erasmus-funded project. Now, the aim of this GCE, the Global Cooperative Entrepreneurship Program, is to stimulate youth cooperative entrepreneurship for them to come up with cooperative startups. Now, it's being implemented via vocational education and training partnerships between cooperative associations and youth organizations. So it's a global program. In Africa, our pilot countries are Uganda and Zimbabwe. We have 3 cooperative entrepreneurs for Uganda, and we have 3 cooperative entrepreneurs for Zimbabwe. Now, in these 2 countries, we have a cooperative and a youth organization working together as mentors for the youth. So in this picture is one of the trainings that we are carrying out in Uganda, though we brought over the youth and mentors from Zimbabwe to Uganda so that the training can be done together. Training them through a human-centered approach. How do you solve the problems in your community through or via the cooperative enterprise model? So we trained them, the 6 youth, and then we sent them as ambassadors. We call them youth ambassadors to their countries to go mobilize the other youth, think about the business ideas they can start using a cooperative model to solve the problems in their community, and then begin, or that stage we call restart for real, begin a cooperative startup in that kind of business. Next slide. Now, this is one of the youth ambassadors, one of the trained global cooperative entrepreneurs. I put her here because she's living with a disability. And in the cooperative movement, it's all inclusive. So even in the GCE, in the Global Cooperative Entrepreneurs, we have included everybody. She's a lady, and she's also the kind of challenge that she identified in our community was that the people living with disability cannot get employment. So the fact that she has other fellow youth that are living with disability and they cannot get employment in our country, Zimbabwe, then she decided to mobilize them, and together they began farming or keeping rabbits. Now, in their rabbit business, they can employ themselves because cooperatives are owned and run by their members. They can employ themselves and they can earn an income from their rabbit business, not looking for employment outside. So this is Tendai Mwarambe from Zimbabwe, one of our cooperative entrepreneurs. Next. Now, the cooperative that Laura talked about, here is the registration certificate. This is one of the 2 cooperative startups that have been registered formally by the government. And it's a young people's multi-purpose cooperative. It's a cooperative that is involved in renewable business, in renewable energy. They're installing solar systems and selling solar lamps because the problem they identified in their community, again, is that electricity was very expensive in Zimbabwe, and not everyone, especially in the rural areas, could afford electricity. So they started their renewable energy business of selling lamps, solar lamps, and installing solar energy. Now, they did not, most of them did not have the skills. So they partnered again, of course, with our mentoring team in Zimbabwe from the cooperative Zimbabwe Housing National Cooperative Organization and the Junior Achievement Zimbabwe. They found for them a solar company that was willing to give them an internship. They have been there for 6 months and they have now been able to do the solar installations in Zimbabwe. Now, another thing I need to tell you about the cooperative startups that have been registered, these are the 2 that have been registered in Zimbabwe. And those that have not been registered out of the 6 are 4. We have 3 in Uganda. And one of the reasons could have been one of the impact of the COVID, because I think the lockdown in Uganda began earlier than in Zimbabwe. So the government offices were not working in Uganda. And so their paperwork has been submitted and they're yet to be registered. I hope by the end of this year, they should be registered. There is a number I'm putting there as a non-corporate global cooperative entrepreneurs, COP startups. We are calling the GCE youth ambassadors. So the youth in Zimbabwe and also in Uganda, they started reaching out to other youth, not necessarily to start cooperatives with them, but to begin their own cooperatives. So in Zimbabwe, the youth there have been to 3 provinces and mobilized around 15 other cooperatives that are also ready for registration. But I think once the government offices begin working fully, then they will do the training for them and then register them fully. Now I said we have the pilot in Uganda and Zimbabwe. In Uganda, Andy, one of the global cooperative entrepreneurs, has mobilized 60 members. Rita has mobilized 45, and Agri has mobilized 40. In Zimbabwe, the number of cooperative members, Wisdom, who is the founder of the Young People's Multipurpose Cooperative, has mobilized 45. Raymond has mobilized 16 members, and their cooperative is the second one that has been registered in Zimbabwe. And they are involved in quality steel works. So they are manufacturing windows and doors for, actually one of their customers is the housing cooperative. And then the Tendai, the young lady that I showed you, the one with the agribusiness of keeping rabbits with our fellow people living with disabilities. So those are the cooperative numbers from the pilot program, the Global Cooperative Entrepreneurs in Africa. Next. Now, in the cooperatives, we have 7 principles, and one of the principles is concern for community. Now, the Young People's Multipurpose Cooperative, during these COVID times, has been reaching out to the slum areas. At this point, they are donating buckets, I think, for people to wash their hands in the slums and some sanitizers. So they are presenting this to the police person so that they are able to, in an organized way, present the buckets for washing hands and also the sanitizers in the slums. I think the slum is a slum in Harare, it's called Epworth. That's where they were distributing this. And besides that, they have also done a lot of outreach, giving food and all these other essentials for during these COVID times. And not only the young people's cooperative, even these other big cooperatives, I think they have been involved during these times in reaching out, using this principle of concern for community. They have been reaching out to either the government, donating to the government kitties, or even using their general reserves to reach out to their members, their employees, and also give food donations. And cooperatives like the savings and credit cooperatives have also been giving loan moratoriums for their members so that they can ease the pain of this COVID pandemic on their members. Next. And sorry, one thing I didn't mention about the Young People's Multipurpose Cooperative, they are not only, when they are selling the solar lamps, they are also giving a commission of $3 to the youth outside the cooperative who are willing to become sales agents for their solar lamps. So that's kind of way of creating employment also for their fellow youth in the community. So now I'll give some recommendations, especially from the cooperative perspective. And these recommendations, most of them, I got them from the legal framework analysis that has been done. This is a global research that has been done by ICA, of course, with funding from the EU. And in Africa, it has been done in 13 countries. Our dream, of course, is to see the legal framework analysis, since it's a tool that the International Cooperative Alliance can use to advocate and lobby for a more enabling environment for cooperatives to operate in their countries. We would like to see this, of course, with more funding continuing to cover more countries. So far in Africa, we've only done 13 countries, and Africa has 54 countries. So we are far away from getting to a comfortable place where we'll be comfortable that in all countries that the legal framework analysis study has been done, so that we can see how to lobby and advocate for a better operating environment in that country. Now, under the legal reforms or institutional reforms, I think from Egypt, they seek a unification of cooperative legislations, leading to drafting of a common law for cooperatives, supplemented by specific texts applying to each type or form of cooperative according to the sector. Then the amendment of cooperative laws to recognize and translate the cooperative values and principles into action. I think this came from Tanzania, Uganda. Then bring the management and licensing of SACCOs and the Cooperative Societies Act. I think this is in Uganda, where the licensing and management of savings and credit cooperatives is under the Microfinance Act, and it doesn't serve the SACCO much. Then in some countries like South Africa, they seek land reforms for farmers, and this will make farming viable and also boost cooperatives like the agricultural cooperatives. And then establishing, I think this is in Zimbabwe, independent tribunals that can effectively handle cooperative cases. And then appoint cooperative representatives to be part of portfolio committees. I think these are public policy committees, to improve their participation in public policy and dialogue so that their voice can be heard. And then when it comes to appointment to board positions, skills need to be considered, and this is going to improve leadership and governance. And the big thing about mainstreaming gender into cooperative leadership positions, such as establishing a quota system for board positions, this would help a lot in mainstreaming gender. And then reduce the minimum number of required members to form a primary cooperative. This, I remember, was a case in Uganda, where the required number is 30. So if this could be reduced to be 15 or even 10, like in Zimbabwe, this is going to encourage a lot of other professionals like lawyers to form a cooperative. Next, Simon. Thank you.
Rose, we're pretty much out of time, so if we could wrap up.
Okay, so this is a map of the legal framework analysis in Africa. At your own time, you can check it. I think Mark has provided a link. Next. Then we have financial reforms, setting a tax regime specific to the cooperative sector, given its specificities, establish a development fund for education and training of cooperatives, and then reinforce financial and human resource capacity for State Department of Cooperatives. This is going to promote cooperative development and have a standardized financial reporting and management. In terms of operation reforms, cooperatives should be placed under one relevant ministry. I think in Nigeria, they're in very many different ministries in different states. Then standardization and improvement of training materials, the ones that the government uses. Then cooperative structures to be aligned with the administrative boundaries, national, provincial, district, whatever the case might be, and standardization of the cooperative charter of accounts to have a national accounting guideline to which every cooperative should adhere to. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you. So we're pretty much out of time. I see that some of the Q&A questions have been answered in the Q&A as well, so that's great. But I really, I wanted to maybe take just the time for a couple questions, since I see we still have our attendees and participants. So let's give it a try and wrap up after that. There are a lot of questions and we cannot cover all of them. Let's try. So there's a group of questions which is about the regulatory framework and whether informality is a product of bad regulation or is it a product of the low human capital, low productivity. Then some related questions are, what would be an appropriate strategy in supporting, or if possible, legalizing the informal sector. So essentially acknowledging the situation and finding solutions how to legalize them, rather than focus on formalization. And then another related question is that business reforms need government support, and how do you bring reforms in a country with corruption, bureaucracy, regulations, etc., etc. So this is sort of a group which is related to a similar topic. I think maybe I think Judith wanted to answer one of these or some of those, and for the other panelists, feel free to jump in as well.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I will start with that question about whether informality is a result of bad regulation, low human capital, or low productivity. Well, I think all these factors, they impact informality, right? It can be due to all of these factors. But as we've been saying, informal enterprises, they come in all kinds and flavors. And the situation in countries are very different. So we need to look at the country context, and we need to look at certain segments of enterprises to see what solutions we need. And in the ILO, we usually talk about the drivers of informality. So we do a diagnostic, we analyze what these drivers are for certain groups, and then we try to address them. And I also think there's no either or, right? Because it doesn't mean that if productivity is low, you don't need regulatory approaches. You can also work on regulatory reforms to improve productivity. But just to wrap up, for me, in the ILO, we talk about making it easier for enterprises to formalize, putting in place incentives to make it more attractive, but also lifting productivity and working at the same time on enforcement, because some enterprises, they could, but they're just not willing to formalize. So we really need tailored approaches depending on the situation of the enterprise, the country, and what we find from our assessments.
Okay, thanks, Judith. Anyone else? I think it's Marty. Seems like she wants to say something, but you're muted, Marty, in case you wanted to say something.
I just want to underscore what Judith said, that there are many drivers of informality, and we're living in an era of deregulation, but we've also got growth of the informal economy. So I think, and then I think it's important to look at the spectrum of regulations. It's assumed that the labor regulations are most binding, but for informal enterprises, most of them don't hire workers. And what's very binding, as I illustrated in the urban slide, if you're urban, is the regulations of the city. And what's very binding if you're in agriculture is regulations relating to the sector. So I think for the self-employed, we have to look beyond labor regulations and look at other regulations and what drives it. And there are many drivers. Many of these workers have been doing this particular occupation for generations. It's their hereditary occupation. It's what they do. And so it's not all, you know, plucky entrepreneurs choosing to be informal. There are many, many drivers of informality, including a failure to create formal jobs. We're not creating enough formal jobs.
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else would like to say something about this group of questions or topic? No. Then I'm gonna move to sort of a topic that's of great interest to me as well. So I'm gonna be selfish. So there were questions related to, you know, what can you do in an environment where there is corruption, bureaucracy, in an environment where maybe there is no proper government at all, in sort of fragile and conflict affected situations. And a sort of related, not directly related questions was about, can multinational businesses play an active role in the recovery process of informal economies? Should the answer be affirmative? Are there concrete initiatives carried out in this respect, and how such initiatives are developed? And so it's really about sort of business to business sort of type of interventions, and what businesses can do to improve the business environment. Part of the answer is, some large multinationals have their own systems of self-regulation, of inspecting, of, within their own supply chain, etc. I don't have an answer to this question. As I said, it would be really interesting to explore. And I don't know if any of the other panelists are aware of, Marty, of interventions in that respect.
Well, the supply chain issue is really an important one. And I think the COVID crisis has exposed how the supply chains for essential goods and services operate or don't operate, and how many of the workers in them are informal. And I think it represents a very important moment to rebuild supply chains from below. And I think there's a call for shorter supply chains, less concentrated. In the US, waste is managed by 2 conglomerates, but there are lots of small waste management companies that also need to thrive. So I think it's a moment to look at our supply chains for essential goods and services and see what functions are played. There was a chat about food security and farmers organizations and efforts to link them directly to consumers. But then that bypasses the street food vendors who, in a study in, I think it was 11 cities in Africa, 70% of poor households buy their food from street food vendors. So I think we need to really rebuild the supply chains from below with better governance from above. And the WIEGO network is doing a lot about the supply chains in manufacturing and the regulation of the brand companies at the tip. And just to point on government, that even when the government is not corrupt, not fragile or weak, we have to understand that the state plays a huge role in informality. And part of that informality is at the tip of the economic pyramid. So cities are making deals, bending their own rules with real estate developers all the time. There's not only informality at the base, there's informality at the tip. But at the tip, it is valorized and ignored. And at the base, it's penalized and criminalized. And I think we have to have a mindset shift about state, capital, and the informal economy.
I think that's an excellent point, really. Very, very important. And I don't know, maybe last group of questions was also around digital transformation, and which seems to be accelerated in the COVID-19 sort of situation. And is that affecting those in the informal economy? I'm not sure we have an answer to that question, Marty.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, like the ICA, WIEGO has 500 affiliated organizations in 90 countries, and we have grassroots intelligence on what's happening. What the organizations of workers want is access to those digital platforms, because the individual workers at most very few have a smartphone, and most of them have one cell phone for a whole family, right? And there's evidence also that the digital platforms didn't work for some workers linked to them during COVID, because if you're an Uber driver or a motorcycle taxi driver or a domestic worker who gets your work through the platform, if you're not allowed to work outside and your employer thinks you're the vector of the disease, that platform doesn't make any difference, right? Who benefited from ICTs are all of us who were able to just continue working from our homes. But it really, the digitalized platforms, not a big help right now. But going forward, we want them to be more of a help to the informal enterprises.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. Anyone else on this topic? No. And maybe the last one, just on really gender aspect, and how can governments support business environment reforms to advance interventions to address regularized informal caregiving as part of promoting stronger economic recovery going forward. That's like a question, but essentially, you know, are there any interventions that look at actually that, you know, regularizing this sort of informal household work and caregiving and all those aspects that are prone to affect women more.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, WIEGO has a global campaign on care work and informal workers. And it has two faces. One is the need of women informal workers, particularly because they're the ones who provide the unpaid care for public childcare services. But it's also, there's a side of it, which is that the people who provide paid care are usually hired informally. And we really need to take cognizance of that. And this is not just childcare, but healthcare and elder care. Most of the workforce in health in this country, USA, where I am based, the doctors certainly and most of the nurses are hired formally, but you get down to the nursing aide and the ambulance technicians and the ambulance drivers and the cleaners, most of them are hired informally without any health insurance. And I think we just have to take this moment when we realize the essential services that are being provided by informal workers. Not all of them are in informal enterprises, but they're hired as wage workers informally. And I think it's an inflection moment, if we want to seize it, is to focus on essential goods and services. And because we're all now concerned about health and food and transport and really look at the workforce and rebuild better from below. And I think this, if we don't do it now, I don't know when we'll ever do it.
I think you're really, you know, it's to the point, and I think it's a great sort of way to sort of conclude this webinar. I sort of promised I will be very strict on timekeeping, but we went a bit over time, but I think it was really worth it. I think the discussion was so rich and gives us the opportunity to take this forward. This is just, as I said, a piece of the puzzle. So we're looking forward to continuing this discussion. I really wanted to thank all our panelists and our discussants for contributing to this discussion. As I said at the beginning, a recording will be available. I'm very happy about that. So many other colleagues will be available to see it once it's shared. Last but not least, I wanted to thank the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development and all participants, as well as our own World Bank Groups, Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. This is one of the webinars in the series of business environment reform and how to build better. So looking forward to the next webinars that will be organized on these topics. Thanks a lot, and of course, stay safe, stay healthy. Looking forward to continuing this discussion